Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining our webinar today on rent relief. We've got 132 people here, and that represents about 60 different QSR and other brands. We've got 5 panelists, and I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our panelists before we start with the presentations. So, first of all, Mary Aldrip, Franchise Council of Australia. Mary, could you just say hello, please?
Good morning, everyone.
Right. Serge Infanti from Foodco. Serge.
Good morning.
Giro from Santuro.
Good morning, everyone.
Stephen Spring, Australian Retail Lease Management.
Good morning, everyone.
And Simon Fontaine from Lease Info.
Morning, everyone. Great to be here.
Right. All right, let's get things started. And I am going to invite Mary back into the room to give her presentation. Mary, over to you.
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here this morning. This is certainly a very topical issue for the Franchise Council of Australia's nearly 500 member businesses. Franchising is a very dynamic and diverse sector, but a large proportion, about 40% of our members operate in the food and retail space. And as far as top order issues go, commercial leasing would have to be a barbecue stopper of a conversation topic. It is regularly nominated in our member surveys as a number 1 or 2 issue that's concerning our members. And in the context of today's discussion, just moving to the next slide on my my presentation, I'd like to go just briefly to some of the issues that we confronted pre-COVID-19 that we're regularly getting feedback on, and that really is summed up into 3 key areas. One is just the natural imbalance of power between large commercial landlords and tenants. In our experience, often it's smaller landlords that are more reasonable and willing to communicate with tenants, but larger commercial landlords have conventionally been quite difficult to deal with, communicate with, and that's for a number of reasons. We're often getting feedback from member businesses about ridiculous or unreasonable make good clauses in their leasing agreements, which especially if a tenant's leaving a lease agreement, the make good stipulations in those agreements can be exorbitantly expensive and unreasonable. And I guess that goes hand in hand with high escalation of year-on-year rent on a percentage basis. So often if a tenant signs up to a 5-year agreement, it might be 5 on 5 on 5. They can make the first 5% increase, but increasing after that just becomes very difficult to absorb for a lot of small business operators, and even pre-COVID-19, retail has been doing it quite tough for a number of reasons, with thin margins, and that just adds to an immense amount of pressure. Just moving to the next slide, we recently worked with Fran Data to do a pulse check of our members on a number of key issues. And one of those areas was landlord flexibility and support. And not surprising to us, a lot of landlords, a lot of member businesses that were surveyed about their interactions with landlords noted that they were unhelpful or very unhelpful by a large number of respondents that were involved in commercial landlord arrangements. If I just move to the next slide, following on from that, you can see from the same report that we worked with Fran Data on, other than those systems that were not in a commercial leasing agreement, so not applicable to their franchise system, which was about 23%. Unhelpful landlords were around 18%, indifferent 31%, and unhelpful 22%, although 6% did nominate very unhelpful. Just moving to the next slide, and this is, I guess, looking at a breakdown of not impacted. So mobile services like dog washers, for example, lawn mowing, etc., service-based businesses, they're not really impacted by commercial leasing arrangements. The businesses that we had that said nominated their landlords as having the best experiences, so lodging, business services, I guess where they're renting office space, and the worst experiences were felt by retail food, restaurant, and baked goods, so bakeries, etc. Just moving to the next slide. In the present COVID-19 environment, it's been very challenging across the board, and we recognise that there are a lot of landlords also that are experiencing a downturn in business and revenue, and that's affecting them as well. We've worked hand in hand with our members through this period, regularly surveying them, conducting webinars, and making sure that we're giving them the best practical set of resources and tools to help them through this. So to sum up, I think a couple of key issues that our members have felt through the COVID-19 environment. Obviously, their business restrictions, business operations are restricted. So if we break that down into two groups, one of which would be unable to operate completely because of government restrictions. So you're looking at beauty salons, Pilates studios, gymnasiums, so unable to operate at all. And yet in many cases, we still had members in those categories coming to us saying, my landlord's, demanding full rent. And not willing to compromise at all. Then we had a lot of members coming to us in the retail food space, particularly saying, look, we've approached our landlord and they're just not willing to communicate, or there are onerous requirements that they're expecting. And I've had a lot of franchisees contact me. I've got one franchisee in Western Sydney who I'm in regular contact with about some very onerous requirements that their landlord are putting on. And we're working through those. And then businesses that are still operating, but, for example, in shopping centre food courts, their turnover is down 90%. And if I just go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of that. So this is, we've actually had this letter sent through from a number of member businesses where they've written to their landlord and said, we're going through financial hardship. Could we just sit down and talk to you about that? And they've been sent back a letter. Obviously, we've redacted the details for confidentiality, but the landlord has requested that they sign a confidentiality agreement just to sit down and to discuss their case of hardship, which, energy companies don't do that, insurance companies don't do that, bankers don't do that, and landlords shouldn't be doing that. So we've raised that example with the government as well. Moving to the next slide. Obviously, the biggest issue through the COVID-19 has been getting through a national commercial leasing code of conduct. This has been difficult for the federal government to lead because conventionally leasing issues are constitutionally state-based, but it's been very good to see the National Cabinet pick up this issue that we've been, and I know others have been continually feeding through as a top order issue. Originally, we were told by governments to sit down, tenants should sit down and talk with their landlords, which is all well and good, except for those numerous cases where there's an unwillingness to do so on behalf of the landlord. And I'll go through some of those things, but importantly, I think through the 14 principles in the commercial leasing code of conduct released by National Cabinet, there's a proportionality clause. So it doesn't fix everything when turnover's down by 90%, you can't even break even. But it is starting to take into account that loss of turnover should be reflected in an equivalent reduction in commercial rent. So you've got the 14 principles there, the introduction of a proportionality clause, implemented now by all states and territories. The FCA has written to all states and territories outlining our key areas. Importantly, if you're eligible for JobKeeper, you should be included in this commercial leasing code of conduct. However, where the franchisor holds the head lease for the franchisee, that has caused some ineligibility and some confusion. The deferral principle is an important one, but we don't want to see cases where rent is simply deferred after 6 or 12 months, and a small business that has really struggled through this period and is just getting itself back on its feet is then lumped with a greater sum of money that they're required to pay back. And then, of course, timing of rents is another issue as well, whether that's done on a monthly, fortnightly or quarterly basis can have a bit of a bearing on eligibility for the leasing code of conduct as well. Just moving to the next slide. The path to recovery, that's going to be very important, and we've seen more broadly across the economy that state and federal governments are now very focused on this path to recovery. There's a conversation around a relaxing of business restrictions, and we're providing input to the federal government at the moment on for a return to dine-in, for example. How would that look with social distancing and sanitation practices in place? But the path to recovery is going to be absolutely contingent on the QSR sector, franchising and retail sector. 40% of the Australian workforce is small business. The two biggest issues I see getting out of this period will be supply chain pivot and workforce management issues, reopening with dine-in restrictions, which we're working through, addressing food delivery platform inequity, which is really crippling a lot of small businesses. And absolutely, we've made an important first step, but there needs to be ongoing commercial leasing reform, which the FCA is absolutely committed to working with our members to lead. So thank you very much. Just going to next slide. And I think from me, they would be the key issues, and happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Mary. Appreciate your time today. And I'm sure there's lots of questions. We'll just hold off to the panel part of the webinar. So now I'd like to invite back Simon Fontaine from Leasing Info to give his presentation. Simon, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here. My name's Simon Fontaine. I'm the founder and managing director of Leasing Information Systems. And my topic today will be how COVID-19 is affecting quick service retail from a leasing perspective. So what my presentation will do is cover the key terms of the code, and we'll also be incorporating a worked example based on a model that we built to help our clients navigate the code. So that presentation will then lead into a panel discussion of the 5 members of the panel. So I'll just start by explaining, as Mary said, the federal government has passed a code, which I'm sure everyone is now aware of. And I'll just quickly reiterate what the principles are. So the principles are that you apply the code if your turnover is less than $50 million. And I'll explain the conditions that apply to this $50 million turnover test, because there are 2. And again, it's defined by each state. So you also are eligible if your turnover is greater in terms of drop of turnover by 30% compared to a comparative period, either last month, the corresponding month last year, or quarter. And if you're a new shop, there's also other tests that I'll go through. The next principle is you've got to negotiate on a case-by-case basis, meaning looking at each individual lease. And importantly, you can negotiate outside the code. So the code is there as a set of principles, but there's nothing stopping either party negotiating and coming to an arrangement. As Mary said, and she mentioned that it's very important that this is a good faith code. So the idea behind it is to negotiate in good faith. It's also applicable to all businesses, regardless of whether or not you qualify, but the principles of the code are not binding if you don't meet those tests. So in terms of the what outcomes can you expect if you are in the code, or even if you're not, what sort of expectations are there? As Mary mentioned, there's this proportionality principle. So the proportionality principle is quite simple, that rent payments decrease in proportion to how much your turnover has dropped in sales over the pandemic period and a reasonable recovery period. You can extend the lease by the net reduction in trading affected periods. So in other words, if your turnover was affected for 3 to 6 months, you can request that those months be added on to the term of the lease, and your options will be preserved at the end of that. There's a deferment period, which is the greater of 2 years or the term of the lease. And there's a minimum of 50% of the agreed reductions must be in the form of a rent waiver. In other words, that the rent is forgiven. That's a minimum. It can be higher, depending on what's agreed. And then the other important legislation principle is that if the landlord and the tenant can't agree, then they must go to binding mediation. In this period, landlords have obligations. They must pass on outgoings relief in the form of either land tax or other outgoings benefits that they receive to the tenant. They're not allowed to increase rent during the pandemic period. No penalties for interest on unpaid rent. The tenant cannot trade. They cannot be penalised or charged for outgoings. And the landlord cannot access bank guarantees or personal guarantees. So now we get to the next section, which is what are the individual states doing? Because as Mary said, this is a state-based issue where the states have carriage of the legislation. The New South Wales government has released their code, which is an augmentation of the Retail Leases Act, and it was done as of the 24th of the 4th, 2020. So they have now a definition of impacted leases, which is a two-phase test. The first one is, does the lessee qualify for JobKeeper? And in the 2018-19 financial year, was the turnover of the lessee, and there's a few tests here, less than 50 million. So if the lessee is a franchisee and the franchisee holds the lease, then the turnover is calculated at the store level. If the lessee is a corporation that is a member of a group, then turnover is at the group level. And in other cases, the turnover of the business conducted by the lease. So there's a couple of interesting and important riders on this. So turnover includes internet sales or goods or services. So if the QSR is generating internet sales, and that must be included in the definition of turnover. And the other interesting issue is the definition of a group or a corporation. So the Corporation Act applies. So there's some confusion about how international franchises or international groups that are incorporated or unincorporated in Australia, how that applies, and they're still being worked out at the in terms of amendments to each individual state legislature. As Mary mentioned, there is confusion about whether or not how the franchisor test works, and I'll be asking that to Mary at the panel. But generally, if you're a franchise group and you hold the lease, then the $50 million test applies to your franchise network of franchise fees, not franchise turnover. Then in the next slide, I'm just going to explain how hardship is defined. So it's very similar to the JobKeeper test. So if you have March 20 over March 19, if you have the March quarter 2019 over the March quarter 2020, then that is sufficient to basically justification to the landlord that you have actually dropped this turnover and you are eligible for the code. There is a lot of conjecture about what is required to prove this, and I'll be asking Stephen Spring, who's working with each state, about what is the minimum documentation required that a tenant must provide. But generally, the code talks about documentation that is generated from an accounting system. Usually that could include a BAS. It could include an audited letter from an accountant. It has to be something that's verifiable. So in terms of the principles, as we said, the landlord must reduce in proportion to the reduction in the tenant's business. 50% must be waived. In relation to rent deferment, if the lease is less than 2 years, then you must extend beyond expiry. The minimum repayment plan is 24 months, or the unexpired lease term, which is ever is greater, and you have the right to extend by proportion of monthly impacted sales with options preserved. Now let's get on to outgoings. Outgoings is an area of confusion for a lot of tenants. So most tenants are aware that they are eligible for outgoings relief, but they're not clear as to how that and when that is to be passed on. So majority of leases that are in shopping centres are based on what's called a net lease structure, where the landlord is responsible for providing a budget of outgoings, which is reconciled at the end of each accounting period, whether that's a financial year or whether that is a calendar year. And once that reconciliation occurs, the outgoings that have benefited to the landlord should be passed on to the tenants at that stage. So if there's been land tax relief, there's been insurance deferments, council rate deferments, any benefit should actually be reconciled and passed on to the tenant at that stage. So that is one area. If the tenant is paying directly the landlord's outgoings, then the tenant and the landlord should basically be invoiced based on the reduced or waived outgoings, not the full amount. So that's something for tenants to be aware of. The other area of conjecture is promotion levy. So similar to outgoings, promotion levy is a budget in advance of planned expenditure for promotion in the centre. So if the centre, and a lot of centres have obviously either suspended their promotions or they have reduced it, then the tenant and the landlord should negotiate either a waiver of the promotion levy, or they should reach an agreement and discuss about how promotion levy will be affected by the pandemic period in terms of the landlord's planned expenditure. I'll be getting onto state legislation with Stephen shortly, because he's right on top of it, but only a few states have legislated and some are still pending. It's also very important to understand what land tax is available in terms of relief. So this is a summary which I'll be distributing to all the participants through Justine's website. So it takes you through what land tax reliefs are available for landlords, which again you should as a lessee benefit from. So each state has its own, and it consists of waivers and deferments as per this chart. The other very interesting development has been the ACCC has granted the ARA a decision to collectively negotiate and share information during this pandemic period and a reasonable recovery period. So this was in response to the Shopping Centre Council's request, which was granted, which was a similar request about sharing information. So this is now a live judgment, and it protects the members of the ARA who can collectively negotiate, but it does have some riders in that you cannot share information that is sensitive, such as lease incentives or individual rent reductions at the lessee level. So it'll be interesting to see how this actually plays out and whether this is a forerunner to more reform around information sharing and gathering between the leasing sector. As I said, New South Wales has passed its legislation, WA has as well, and Tasmania, I believe Victoria as well, and all other states and territories are close to passing, and Stephen will update us on that. So now I'm going to give you a quick worked example based on a model that we built internally to help our clients to explain the rent relief because there's so much confusion there around in the community about how this works. So this is an example of a particular lessee that was under the code. So you can see that the lease commenced on the 15th of April 2019, expired in 2023, had a 4.3 year lease term, $250,000 of rent, 4% rent increases, a gross lease with no extensions or option exercise. And there was no rent increase during the pandemic period. So basically the cash flows work as follows. You can see here that as per normal, up until March, it was normal rent payable. But in April, the lessee reported a 94% drop in rent, and which the landlord accepted. And the calculation is relatively straightforward. So it's simply this figure times by 94% times by 50%. So that is the amount that's waived. That is the amount which 50% is deferred, and this amount is actually payable, so which represents 6%. So you can see here, this is a cumulative rent amount deferred. And if we project forward, these figures, some of these have not been agreed yet, but based on a projection like this, the lessee at the end of the pandemic period would end up paying, have an amount deferred of $52,720 and sorry, $54,000 in deferral, which is the sum of all these. And as you can see, there's no rent increases allowed during the pandemic period. So this lease actually had a rent increase in August, which was not allowed. So the first time it comes out of the pandemic period, the rent is increased. The other thing to note is how the rent deferment works. So you can see here, this is amortized, which is the rent payment over the remaining term of the lease. And this figure here is the balance of the deferment, which goes down to 0 at the end of the period. So it's added on to the rent, and then the lease just works as per normal. Now, this is obviously an example where the lessee was a strong tenant and they've agreed to full repayment, but obviously it works on a case-by-case basis. But mathematically, this is how it will work. Now, also, the model assumes that there's no reasonable recovery period, which in practice will depend on a case-by-case basis. And if you need assistance with how this model works, please contact us. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'm going to now go on to the next section, which is a panel discussion. And the panel discussion will consist of two parts. So the first part is I will ask each of our panelists a set of questions, and then I'll open it up to the forum for questions. Now, if you are writing to the forum, please make sure you put who you want the question addressed to. But there are some house rules. So the first one is, please don't ask the panel members to say anything confidential. And please make sure that panelists, when you answer, please make sure that everything is in the public domain. The other house rule is this is an industry forum. Obviously, the views of the members are their views. And we, as a group, want to state that the views should be taken as representative of the panelists, but may not be representative of the whole industry. So let me just start with my first question is to Mary. Mary, can you hear me?
I can.
Mary, I just wanted to question about any update on how the code is applying to the franchise sector in terms of the test of the $50 million at franchisor level, because there's been a lot of confusion about if you're a franchisor, whether it's the franchise fees of the lessor or it's the actual group turnover of the franchisor.
Yeah, it's a very good point that you raise, and it is causing a bit of confusion, especially where the lease, it's a head lease held by the franchisor who might not fit into that JobKeeper definition. So the regulations have now been implemented at a state government level, but I'm getting quite a bit of feedback. For example, in Victoria, those regulations only apply to eligible leases, meaning where a lease where a tenant has turnover of $50 million or less is entitled to JobKeeper payments. So that's causing some confusion, which we're trying to raise now at a state by state level, because it's really finished that process at a national cabinet and federal government level. But it does mean that those franchisees who might be captured under a head lease by the franchisor and are seeking a rent reduction from themselves will not be able to derive the same benefit under the corresponding head lease. So it's a pretty significant business risk at the moment, which we're working through. There are some very receptive and engaged small business commissioners at a state level that we're working through with. Victoria have established a commercial leasing advisory group with a small business minister, which has been very proactive. And tomorrow there's a meeting with the Queensland Premier on a range of small business issues, which we'll be raising this at as well. But for the moment, it is causing quite a bit of confusion.
So, Mary, just to be clear then, if you are, let's just do an example. If you're a franchisor and you are, let's take, I'm not going to mention a name, but say the franchisor earns revenue by charging franchise fees. It may have a couple of corporate stores, and it may have some merchandising or supply fees. So is it your understanding that at the moment, it's the sum of those fees that the franchisor obtains, that's the test of the 50 million, not the aggregate of the individual store franchise turnovers, which are actually the franchisee's turnover? Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's the group turnover, which we're trying to raise at the moment at a state government level. The other thing that we're working on is with the National Retailers Association. So we'll be joining with them, the AHA, the Hotels Association, and the Pharmacy Guild, to put forward an application to the ACCC on an exemption on collective bargaining as well. So we're working on a couple of things there, but for the moment, that JobKeeper and head leasing issue is probably the biggest issue that we're trying to work through.
Okay, great. Then the next question, which is pretty topical, is how can you ensure that rent relief granted to franchisors are passed to franchisees in the case where the franchisor holds the lease?
Well, I think there's very strong compliance mechanisms attached with the code, as well as JobKeeper, and transparent way of doing business and passing through that relief. So there's very strong regulatory and compliance framework attached, which everybody will be adhering to.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, the last question is, you've obviously seen the ACCC judgment allowing ARA members to share information such as collectively bargain. Do you anticipate that the FCA will join that, or do you see that something that's relevant or beneficial to the industry?
So I think it's a good move. We work quite closely with the National Retailers Association, and so we've had a couple of discussions this week with them where we're just finalising a submission that will be jointly signed on by the Pharmacy Guild, the AHA, the Franchise Council, and led by the National Retailers Association, to also put a submission in to the ACCC. I think it's better when a number of peak bodies can work together on these issues rather than inundating the ACCC with multiple applications. And the good thing about our application is that it won't just cover one particular industry or sector. It will be, if the ACCC accept our application, it will cover all of our member businesses.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Mary. So the next question's for Serge. Serge, do you see pandemic lease structures changing as a result of this crisis, and if so, how?
Thanks, Simon. Look, firstly, I'd like to say that it was refreshing to see the government announce the principles around the code, given that we were facing a pretty awkward discussion with a lot of the landlords around Australia after the impact of COVID. Without it, would be impossible, I think. So, firstly, welcoming the code as it is great. I think there's a sting in the tail in the code and the principles, and that's around the deferred rent. My view on this is that most lessors will sit down and work out whether it's within the boundaries of the code or within the requirements of the retailer, will work out a situation that gets you through the next 3 to 6 months. So structures will change, and I don't think it's necessarily going to apply that the conditions of the code are going to be relevant in every situation. I think there's going to be some flexibility around retailers. Most landlords I've spoken to have indicated a desire to keep the doors open and to return the shopping malls to where they were pre-COVID. And that means that all retailers need to be firing at 100% to do that. So the feeling I'm getting from most lessors is that they're open to discussions on what's the most appropriate mechanism, what's the most appropriate formula to apply to retailers, whether it's as per the code or as per the specific needs of a retailer. That deferred rent, I think, is a problem, and I think it needs to be wrapped up in not just a deferment of the term or a structured repayment plan, but there's a lot of leases that will get into renewal phase over the next year or two, and that deferment rent needs to be considered as part of the overall strategy around the lease, the ongoing lease, and not just a deferred payment plan. Do I think it'll change structures of leases in the longer term? You've got to remember that prior to COVID, we were in a pretty depressed retail environment anyway, and that leases based on supply and demand were starting to change. So there were terms that we were able to negotiate even pre-COVID, which were different to what was around maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So there can be some changes in the way the leases are, but I've heard a lot of retailers talking about percentage rent will be the way of the future, blah, blah, blah. I honestly don't believe that to be the case. I think there will always be a fixed rent notion and a fixed term notion in leases, and that will vary depending on market expectation, and certainly depending on which niche you're operating in. It's going to be very different if you're in a departmental niche or a specialty fashion retailer niche versus a hospitality niche, and the supply and demand will play a key role in determining what the lease structures are in the longer term. They will change in the short term, and there's a willingness, I think, from lessors and retailers to sit down and work through this collaboratively and constructively.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you've sort of answered my next question, which was on rent deferment. So I'll jump to the next question, which is, which sectors of QSRs do you believe will have the fastest rate of recovery? And as a corollary, what factors of those businesses will aid the speed of their recovery?
Look, I'd like to think it's retail and hospitality, food and beverage and hospitality that will recover faster. And I'll just go back to the social needs of the human race. And I think we're all keen to get out and about. We have options in other specialty retail areas with online, but I think generally the areas that will recover faster are those around food and beverage, hospitality, entertainment. I'll see those as the driving forces behind getting society back into what is the new norm, if you like. As to what's required from retailers to get confidence back into the consumer market, I think social distancing is going to be a factor for at least the next 12 months. So those retailers need to be ahead of the game in this and make sure that they're covered off all the aspects of social distancing and communicate that to the consumer, make sure the consumer feels comfortable coming into their environment, make sure their communication with their staff is clear and concise as to what's required in this area. Cleaning protocols need to be reinforced and have certainly taken on a different dimension since COVID. I think it's possible that sustainability will still be there, and I don't think I've seen a couple of reports saying sustainability isn't the key here. I disagree with that. I think sustainability will remain as a key focus for retailers, and they shouldn't put that on the shelf. They should continue to focus on that area as well as the other requirements that I've just mentioned. Retailers need to focus on rebuilding the confidence in their local communities. So I know for my team, we're spending a lot of time on local area marketing, on making sure our social media is up to scratch, and in ensuring that our consumers are aware that we are taking the necessary steps to rebuild that confidence. Clearly, there are things like delivery of food and making food more accessible to the consumer, how you get it to them, whether it's a viable delivery platform or whether it's a drive-through option or a pickup option at the centre level. These things need to be considered, but I think the retailers that lead in these areas will be the ones that have better chance of recovery.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Serge. Giro, good morning. How do you see the code applying to the franchising sector as opposed to the general retail sector? Because obviously they're very different, but there's one size fits all with this code.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, look, I guess as a franchisor, there's no two ways about it. We are in a pretty vulnerable and uncomfortable position, and especially since that, we're very highly exposed, and in that sector of hospitality, which has obviously been impacted by the restrictions on what people are and aren't allowed to do. And look, so being in that very uncomfortable meat in the sandwich position where on one hand, I've got a loyalty to my franchise partners who we need to support and coach and guide through this crisis. But the reality is that they simply can't afford to sustain those rents at current levels, as we could all imagine. And we obviously can also understand that profit margins in our sector, in the QSR food restaurant space, were already razor thin coming into the crisis. And I think it's also important to note that our sector particularly, being one that does have a highly casualised workforce and a young workforce at that, JobKeeper was certainly not the silver bullet that some might have rushed to think it was. So look, I guess, unfortunately, while the code is encouraging in terms of its wording and its intent, when in the cold hard light of day, when I get letters from landlords' lawyers, citing the the lowest common denominator interpretation of that code. You know, it leaves us as a franchisor in quite a vulnerable position. And, you know, it does leave me thinking about fair ways to come out of this process together with landlords to, you know, share that risk and look at that upside. And certainly, I do think that there's a need for a more fair basis to strike rent. I don't necessarily subscribe to the theory that we can't look at turnover or even traffic-based rental bases to build into our leases going forward. I mean, there are plenty of anchor tenants, there are plenty of supermarkets and cinemas and whatnot who already have those sort of provisions built into their leases. And yeah, as an old actuarial student, I know that, you know, if we were to give the actuaries and the valuers that task of valuing leases based on some variability in turnover or traffic, it is possible. So yeah, I certainly don't buy that at all either. So yeah, look, I guess that's the uncomfortable position we're sitting in as a franchisor.
And do you see, from your business, do you see any substitution between strip retail and shopping centres post-pandemic?
Yes, absolutely, we do, and we're actually already seeing quite a significant migration away from you know, trade in our shopping centres towards local strips and also digital and online channels. So look, particularly for our dessert format, we have quite an exposure to entertainment and leisure precincts in and out of shopping centres, and reality is a lot of those are next door or in and around cinemas, bowling alleys, play centres, and other restaurants, which obviously rely on a quantum of foot traffic, and already, you know, I think we're seeing not only a migration in traffic during the pandemic, but also customers probably now increasingly like looking to keep it local, and not only are we seeing that play into the, I guess, play into a migration to strip and street centres, but also with the acceleration of people jumping online and delivery. Reality is that most of our strip sites have far better accessibility and proximity to the customer bases and helps drive that. So, and I think there's probably one other trend that, looking ahead, we'll see, especially in the near term, is there probably a resurgence of local travel, local holidays, day trips, families jumping in cars and doing their you know, looking to perhaps some more of the traditional strip centres and tourist precincts, which I think again might accelerate this transition away from shopping centres, especially in the short term.
Okay, thank you, Giro. I'm just going to go on to Stephen now. Stephen, can you give us an update on all the state-based legislation, where they're at? Because there's a number of questions about this from the panel as well. Sorry, from the board. So please.
Okay, so because under the Constitution, property law is state-based law, the National Tenancy Code, which is basically the framework, and then each state has to implement its various different things. And originally, what they did is they changed some emergency legislation, and now that the code was agreed at a national level, the states have drawn it down. I've actually got an updated table that I'm updating on a regular basis whenever the bill that goes before Parliament has now been enacted and it's been assented to. And like Tasmania at the moment is nearly there. They've gone through the process, and nearly all the states have followed through. So there's a table that's on the front of my website, retaillease.com.au, which is just an updatable thing. And don't forget that there's also probably going to be some other regulations that are going to impact particular types of tenants, because most of the legislation talks about classes of tenants. So say, for instance, you know, certain parts of Sydney that are very, very tourist based, they may be more impacted than other parts of Sydney that have got shops in large shopping centres that are still have the local population. Whereas if you go down to Circular Quay or the Opera House, those classes of tenants may very well be more impacted. So maybe be more regulations that come down the line.
Okay, fantastic. Stephen, you've done a lot of experience in mediation. A lot of clients are confused about how does binding mediation work.
Yes.
Take us through that process and how do you actually apply for it if you need to?
Okay, so essentially mediation is it's not a court or anything. It's essentially where the two parties sit in the room to discuss their problems with a neutral mediator. And often what a mediator is either an ex-judge or it might be a lawyer that specialises in this area. And that's really the middle ground. If the parties that have been trying to negotiate rent reductions or rent abatements or deferments cannot get to a point where they're just incompatible with what they're putting down on the table to each other, and the offers have gone backwards and forwards, the next stage is to, if you can't agree, apply for this mediation. And that's a state-based thing, and each different state has their own small business commissioner, which appoints mediators for people to turn up. And at the moment we're doing video conferencing and video mediations, and that's what was happening before was there's people that want to hop in and do these video conferencing. But the key to a successful mediation is A, both parties must negotiate in good faith. B, that it's absolutely confidential, and the mediation process cannot be used in a court of law if the parties cannot settle their differences at that time. And probably the most important thing is that you've got to go in there prepared. You don't go in there just saying, I want this and this is what I'm after, with a landlord saying, I want this and this is what I'm after. There's a step process, there's a logical step process of how much the business can afford. If the business cannot afford to open down the track because the balloon payments on the rental are a problem, at that mediation, it may be decided that business should close. So it's a stepped process of working through the differences. And normally what a mediator does is bullet points all the important points and tries to find some common agreement on some of the things. And if there is no agreement, the next step is a certificate of failed mediation, and then people can go off to tribunals and courts and all the rest of it. But as a general rule, all parties have got to be able to they've got to be bound by this mediation agreement. And don't forget, most mediations are around about 85%. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out in this COVID business, but around about 85 do reach an agreement. So each party doesn't get what they want in total, but they get what they can probably live with.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. We're actually running out of time here, so I've got time for a few questions. So I'm going to direct them based on who's asked. So, Stephen, I've got another question for you from the panel. We have a situation where a franchisee has informed the franchisor that their outgoings have increased dramatically, despite the fact that the supermarket in the centre was, and some of the tenants were not open. How can they be ensured that the outgoings are being passed on?
Yeah, that's going to be difficult because some tenants have experienced increases in outgoings simply because the landlord has had to do certain things during the COVID period, extra cleaning and has had to put up barriers and those kind of things. Again, if we're talking about relatively small amounts of money in the overall scheme of things, that should be something that should be negotiable with the landlord. And if it's a significant amount of money and it's worthwhile taking a mediation over, that's something that could be done at a very detailed level at a mediation. But the landlords, they've had to increase some of their expenditure because of COVID as well.
Right. Okay. Then I've got a question for you, Serge. What advice would you give a franchise whose occupancy costs were already high pre-COVID and now paying a deferral rent, which will make the business unviable? Serge? Can you hear me?
Yeah, hold on, that's better. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, look, regarding businesses which were essentially not financially viable prior to COVID, I would encourage you as a franchisee or franchisor to sit down with your landlord and just negotiate an exit strategy here. Clearly, you can't recover. You probably weren't viable financially prior to COVID. You can't recover during COVID, and the deferment of the rent will essentially be the nail in the coffin for you. So there is an obligation to maintain your commitment to the lease, and the Prime Minister made that very clear when announcing the principles that both parties are to maintain the existing lease. So you have to work within the confines of your lease. And I would suggest that the best way to do it is simply sit down with the tenant, with the landlord, work out a commercial solution that you can live with, and then if you need to, proceed to mediation to see if you can resolve it. But the reality is you are bound by a lease, and you probably need to commercially negotiate your way out of that.
Okay, we've only got time for, I think, one more question because it's 1 minute left. So in terms, Stephen, what level of documentation is mandatory for a landlord who is requesting turnover figures in order to adjust rental invoice? So there's a lot of confusion, so maybe you can clear that up.
Yeah, okay, so a lot of landlords are asking for a whole series of documents like profit and loss reports and a whole series of things. That often goes well beyond what's required. You just have to establish the fact that you have a JobKeeper number. With a lot of landlords, they're already given turnover figures, and they have easy comparison. That should be your start point. If it turns out that the business is not viable and you have to show profit and loss reports and all the your cash flow forecasts to show that as a exit strategy, yes, that's okay. You can do that as a separate exercise. But if you've got the JobKeeper, your turnover's dropped by 30%. You've got the protection of the code. That should be your start point. Anything else, like assets and liabilities and other things that they ask for, or some landlords are asking for, are not necessarily at this stage. And the important thing is just one final point is that a lot of BASs are not just a single operator. They may have other businesses that are flowing through that BAS. And if you give that BAS to the landlord, he's going to get a distorted picture of the way that your business is operating.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of great questions here. I just wonder if we have time. Justine, do we have time to answer a couple of more, or are we going to lose the transmission? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So question here for Giro. Do you feel that the balance of power in lease negotiations might swing to the franchisor in some circumstances, given the likelihood that some retailers won't be able to open, and therefore landlords might have to negotiate based on this outcome?
Oh, look, I think it's a good question, and Serge certainly alluded to that earlier, saying that even pre-COVID, we had seen renewals coming in with reductions. We had seen, clauses that might not otherwise have been considered on the table. So there's, I guess that was in play beforehand, and obviously now, if you're a landlord in a shopping centre, you don't want to see a plethora of vacancies. You want to be able to still provide that experience to your customers. So absolutely, I think we are now entering a time where even the most it's just prudent for a landlord to want to keep a tenancy with the lights on. So in turn, that will give us some power in the discussion which we wouldn't have otherwise had.
Okay, fantastic. Another question here, which I guess probably maybe Stephen or maybe Serge. So we have a store that's in a startup phase where they've had strong, like for example, the tenants opened in the last 6 months. They've had strong MAT growth, so they don't have a comp store principle under JobKeeper. What experience have you had where the landlord is saying that you're not eligible, even though the store is now 90% of what it was, but there's just not a corresponding period? to back that up.
So
Well,
you want to take that one?
I'll start because I'm head deep in half of negotiations around Australia with a number of landlords. Look, the reality is, if you haven't got a 12-month history of sales, just try to use the previous quarter. And again, I refer to the fact that there is a good faith provision in the principles of the code. So, you know, you've experienced a significant decline. You've got clearly some financial hardship. I would find it extremely unreasonable for a landlord to say you don't qualify under the code, and I'd be certainly pushing for mediation on that basis. But I would use probably the preceding quarter as a gauge, and then say, you know, your proportional rent reduction should be based on the proportional decline from that quarter.
If I could pick that up.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is industry standards of occupancy cost ratios and turnover figures and sales per square metre, and some landlords have been using that as an example. Other landlords have said, how is your business tracking, and show us your cash flow forecast from you know, if you've been open for 9 months, and go back to your original cash flow forecast, how close were you tracking, and then we can work on something from that basis. And there are some landlords that have aggregated the sales drop from the entire shopping centre, and they've just simply applied that formula to that retailer and said that's probably what you would have done, judging by the drop in the rest of the centre.
And remember that you don't have to accept a deal that you believe is unreasonable, and there's no chance that they can terminate you during the period of COVID. So, you know, stick by your position, articulate it clearly, and if need be, seek mediation.
Okay, I think this will be the last question. So the question is more for Mary. So if from an industry point of view, that what principles do you believe is more important for the franchising sector as a whole? Total business viability, as in make sure that businesses come out, you know, the other side of it, we preserve as many systems as possible? Or do you believe that just getting people through proportionate wave deferrals is critical at the time being? I guess that's a difficult one, but it's short term versus long term.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to be an either or. I think it's a mixture of a couple of things. At the moment, we're very focused on working with the government, providing regular briefs to Treasury, to the Minister's office, on making sure our members, particularly in the food and retail sectors, are ready to resume, you know, a full range of dine-in options, and enter into that recovery phase. And that needs to go, I think, hand in hand with a couple of other measures that will help give all businesses the best possible shot of making it through this. And so, for example, just reopening dine-in in the next couple of weeks is not enough in and of itself. It needs to be staged, I think, with a return to work and a reopening in states that are affected of schools, because if kids are still home, it's difficult for working parents to return to work. If they're not returning to work, it's difficult to reopen, you know, dine-in facilities, for example, and expect customers to be there. So there needs to be a number of considerations in place. But I think, you know, the government's doing a very good job of being highly engaged and actually asking for input from us and other industry bodies on where our members are up to. Our members have very, very good health and safety training already in play that they're able to be able to use on social distancing and sanitation. So I think it's a couple of measures that, but we're very clearly pivoting now from those restrictions and hibernation into the recovery phase. But I think that's going to take months and years ahead to fully get back to a healthy level of business for everybody.
Thank you very much, Mary. And unfortunately, that is the all we have time for. So again, I would like to thank you all. It's been fascinating for the time. I'm going to pass back to Justine for closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you all, panel members and Simon, for facilitating today. I really appreciate you giving up your time to discuss this topic for the industry. And just a plug for the QSR Media Conference and Awards, which is coming back up on the 23rd of June. We'd love to see you all there. Thanks very much. And that's it for me. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.